Welcome to the Beef Cattle Research Council webinar and Swath and Bale Grazing Strategies. So tonight's webinar is actually co-hosted by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as well. So I'm Stacey Domilewski. I'm the Science and Extension Coordinator for the BCRC, and I'll be your moderator tonight. The session is going to last approximately an hour and a half, but may go a little longer depending on the time or the questions you have during the question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, please join us and tweet along with us using #BeefWebinar. We're also recording this session, and I'll email you a link to the recording within the next couple of days. So if you miss hearing anything tonight and want to watch it again, you can, or if you want to pass it along to friends and neighbors, you can do that as well. I would also encourage you to take some notes as well tonight so you can help you to remember a little more about what we're talking about. So of course, you're going to be able to hear and see tonight's presenters, but we can't hear or see you. So if you want to communicate with us, you can type into the small chat window on the control panel on the side of your screen. And if you have any questions or comments for me or either of the presenters, you can do that as well. So feel free to type in your questions for tonight's presenters at any point during the webinar tonight. If you do, but we'll answer them all at the end of the hour. If your internet connection's being a little bit slow tonight, it might help to close the webcam windows. This means you're not going to be able to see our presenters, but it'll hopefully make the audio come through a little clearly and the slides load a little faster for you. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I wanted to tell you about is some very exciting news. We have a door prize tonight. So of all of you that are attending live, we will be drawing 2 names to get the cool forage book. So pay attention to your email. We'll be letting you know that way. So this is what we're going to be covering on tonight's webinar. We'll have both Vern and John Duynisveld talking tonight on Swath and Bale Grazing. So we'll get a little bit of Eastern and Western perspective. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience and finish with some closing remarks and where you can find more information. So with that, we'll get started. So I'm very excited to introduce tonight's presenters. We'll be hearing from, as I mentioned, both Dr. Vern and John Duynisveld. So Vern is a research scientist with Agriculture Agri-Food Canada in Lacombe. He was raised on a farm in southwestern Manitoba and completed his degrees at the University of Manitoba and the University of Guelph. Dr. Vern has led many projects in extended grazing, the environmental impacts of beef production, and forage management, as well as the role of annual forages and beef systems in Western Canada. So next, introducing John Duynisveld. He is a research biologist with Agri-Food and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Nepan, where he's been for the last 17 years. His research includes the effect of forage species on beef productivity, the effect of bioactive forages on beef productivity, as well as extending the grazing season. So as I said, tonight we'll hear from both of our presenters. So they will be presenting together so we can get a little bit of a perspective of both Eastern and Western Canada. All right, so everything looks good here. You're good to go.
Okay, thanks very much, Stacey. Hopefully everybody can hear us. John Duynisveld in Nepan and myself, Vern in Lacombe, are going to provide a webinar tonight on extended grazing, focusing on bale and swath grazing. When we talk about extended grazing, we understand that there are more methods than bale and swath grazing, and so we'll cover a number of different ones, comparing both of those methods to the others. Why I think it's really important to begin by talking about why we want to do bale or swath grazing or any of the other strategies that we have, and that is to reduce the cost of overwintering beef cows. sometimes we get caught up in the process of doing things so that we fall in love with bale grazing, swath grazing, grazing corn, grazing residues, whatever we could do, or we zero in on a particular species that we fall in love with, or maybe we just like watching cows in the winter. But our real goal is to reduce the cost, and we'll talk about how large that cost is, and each of the things that we do are concepts or strategies to reduce the cost. In the case at Lacombe, we spent a lot of time working on swath grazing, and John has worked on bale grazing in the Maritimes. But we know that within each region across Canada, there are specific ways that work better than others and at different times of the winter. So what we're really talking here about is the system management overall, overwintering beef cows. And there's a number of factors that we have to look at when we do that. We're going to talk about the cow factors, the forage factors, and the economic impact. We could go on because this is a very complex system. We could talk about sustainability of the cow herd or sustainability of the beef industry. We could talk about nutrient cycling, how we cycle nutrients through cows as they're grazing on pasture instead of in a wintering site. But tonight we're going to focus on the first three, the cow factors, the forage factors, and the economic impact. We have to compare these strategies to something, and we're going to call that the traditional feeding system. When we all grew up, or at least people my age, when we grew up, the cow herd was based on summer pastures, still is, but in the winter was surrounded by anywhere from about 125 to a 200-day winter feeding period. The feed for that winter feeding occurred through baling hay or conserved feed, conserved silage, could be straw, whatever feed stuff was available as a forage to feed the cows over winter. So spring calving, fall weaning, everybody did the same thing, stacked the feed or put it in a silage pit and fed it out, often in feed bunks at a feeding site or a small to large feedlot. Well, we recognized that that was a costly system. And so we understand that 65 to 75% of the costs of calf production come from feed, pasture, and bedding. And on the prairies, about 30% of the cost comes from winter feed. So our goal was to reduce the feeding costs when we started out doing this work. So that would be the operational costs of feeding during the winter. We also recognized that there was transportation costs in hauling the feed from the field to the stack yard or wherever we were taking it, then moving it out of the stack yard and feeding it to the cattle. Harvesting costs were incurred in baling and silaging, and the advent of the large round bale really improved efficiency and reduced costs, but there were still the harvesting costs that were incurred. And then at some point, moving manure and putting it back out on the fields. So these are largely non-feed costs, feed costs that are not associated with growing the crop. And generally, we're going to talk about them in terms of yardage. Now, yardage per se contains other parts, components, cost components than this, but these are the large portions that we could do something about. The sooner that we can move the feeding into the pasture, into the field, we reduce this cost tremendously. And when we first started out, this was our goal, to reduce that. We weren't too worried about what happened in the field. All that we were concerned about was having the cows survive and winter well, and that feeding system coming through and having good, healthy calves. That's what we were after then. Over the last 15 years, a number of different methods have been adopted for winter feeding, and a number of them here involve grazing. So we might have swath grazing, bale grazing, stockpile grazing, grazing corn, and grazing residue. And this survey that was conducted by the Western Beef Development Center and known as the Western Canadian Cow-Calf Survey was published in 2014. And it showed that a whole series of these grazing methods were carried out during winter, were done by a significant number of people. Nevertheless, even though we showed that in some of these methods we reduced the daily cost of feeding cows by 50%, and that was a considerable savings when you multiply that times a large number of cows used by all these respondents, people had not really eliminated the use of bales. And what's more, if you look across the screen here from swath grazing through to residue, and you added up all those numbers, you'd get far more than 60% of producers using them. Well, probably what's happening now is some producers are using more than one method. In fact, some producers may be using 3 methods. So that maybe in southern Manitoba, second cut forage may be used, followed by corn grazing. Or in Alberta, maybe stockpile grazing might be used, followed by swath grazing, and then bale grazing. And bale grazing might be used in the Maritimes. But people still haven't stopped using bales, and one of the reasons is that all of these extended grazing practices used during the winter are more risky than feeding cattle in a feedlot using conserved feed. So if you pardon the pun, using bales is a bailout for bad weather and anything that might happen that would prevent you from using one of the swath, extended grazing practices. So we've kind of evolved to more complex systems of wintering cows that are based on extended grazing for those of producers that use them. We still have the summer pasture, and the 125 to 200 winter feeding days are chipped away at because they're the most expensive part. Feeding in a feedlot, or the alternative to them, would be $2 to $3 per cow day. So a combination of any number of them could be used if they're used in the right spot, from stockpile grazing, swath grazing, or bale grazing, and that would include grazing corn and any other forms of grazing in the pasture during the winter that might occur. To get a look at the total costs, we're going back to the Saskatchewan Forage Council information that they published in 2011. They used some of our data, some data from Saskatchewan and across the prairies anyway, and they compared what we call the traditional method to any number of the extended grazing methods. And what we see is that the yardage cost, or the non-feeding costs, that includes starting a tractor and using it in the winter, moving feed, feeding it at a site, yardage amounted to about 50%, and the cost that we see here is higher than any of the other extended grazing methods. We've multiplied up the daily feeding, as you see, for 100 days for 100 cows. It just seems that producers find this easier to relate to. They write the checks in these amounts, and 100 cows is kind of getting to be a number that's easy to grasp in cow herds, and we want people to at least be able to graze for 100 days. So what we see here with the extended grazing systems is that we've really done a good job in lowering the yardage cost, and we see that the more intensive machine operation is in the method, the higher the total cost will be. The potential savings, looking at some of these same systems, if we again look at it in terms of 100 cows for 100 days, we see straw buncher is the best in this case, used commonly in Saskatchewan, parts of eastern Alberta, and then bale grazing is the most. It tends to be the least risky method, and I would say bale grazing is the least risky. They generally cost the most, but The cost varies from farm to farm and location to location, and it may be that a producer that's bale grazing in one part of the prairies, for example, is just as efficient economically as another producer that's swath grazing in another part of the prairies. If we want to break the costs down, just in case you're starting to get curious about it, into more component parts, this slide is research that we carried out for 5 years at Lacombe, and we're comparing a traditional method to swath grazed triticale, corn, and barley, and we'll just look at a few things about it. Anything above the green here is by and large your yardage cost, and you can see that there's not so much difference between the crop production costs on a per cow day basis. For example, between maybe the traditional and barley. But we have a significantly larger yardage cost that's composed of processing, feed delivery, bedding delivery, and manure removal. And many people are surprised just how much feed delivery amounts to. When we look at the swath grazing examples, we know that barley and triticale costs about as much to grow, and at Lacombe we can get a much larger yield of triticale that results in a higher carrying capacity, and so the cost per day of triticale use is lower. The cost per kilogram of feed production is lower than it is with barley. Corn costs much more to grow than barley and triticale, but the yield is closer to triticale, so it tends to be costing in between the two. We want to look at the crop cost because we've kind of dwelt on yardage. When we first started working with these extended grazing practices, we were really targeting yardage. But then we found that we had to grow crops in a certain way to deliver the crop product, usually by the end of September. And in certain cases, we had yield decreases compared to when we would plant crops at their optimum. So if you plant barley in middle or late June, you got as much as a 40% yield decrease. But anyway, if you look at the cost of production of a hay crop from up to the time of windrowing or swathing, it's about the same cost as it would for you to grow barley. Now there's some differences there in that barley silage is more expensive to produce and corn is more expensive to produce because of the cost of corn seed. And then here we have stockpile grass, which in this case is second cut grass, and its cost is very low. And that's because in our calculation, the first cut is taken off as hay and probably represents 3/4 of the annual yield. And so by the time you proportion out the cost of that stockpile grass is low, and it's a very nutritious and good stockpiled feed. A couple other things we want to cover before we move into other details is you have to realize that in extended grazing, it's meant a whole lot to the beef industry in terms of reducing the labor required to winter beef cows. And that means some producers can keep more cows and some families can have cows at all. If you look at the number of hours for 100 days for 100 cows of winter feeding, you can see that the labor requirement is over 20 man days, 28-hour days. If we look at all of the extended grazing practices, they're less than 10. And so that has a huge impact on farms in terms of handling labor. Another factor which you may or may not think is important is the amount of land required for winter feed production. And in this case, where we can have high yields of extended grazing crops, it reduces the amount of land we need. We find if we're basing our yield, our land area on green feed for barley, for example, it may take about the same or a bit less, depending on how we're growing the crop. But by and large, these extended crops can reduce the amount of land that you need. Stockpile grass is another matter, though, because the yield is lower, and one of the pinch points there is that if you depend on stockpile grass for all of your winter grazing, it might take a lot of land. Now, John, you had some comments about the amount of land that you needed for stockpile grass in Nova Scotia.
Well, yeah, in Atlantic Canada, we tend to have a little more rainfall, a little better conditions for growing our second cut forage. So typically what we've been seeing at Nepean when we've done our fall grazing research with the tall fescue, if we take our first harvest sometime in sort of the last part of June, first part of July, and then we stockpile that until early November for grazing, we can be between 3,500 and 4,500 kilograms of dry feed available for grazing per hectare. So that's probably somewhere around 60 to 80% of what our first harvest yield may be in that case. And it's pretty good quality feed as well.
So the yields that we're using here in our calculation for stockpile grass are about 3,000 kilograms per hectare, 3,000 pounds. Now we know that we can get more than that, but in the work that we did, it just happened that that's the yields we got. And that was with meadow brome grass, a grass that has good regrowth. Diesel fuel required for winter grazing, the savings are really, really important. And while we said we weren't going to talk about sustainability, we're going to in this slide. In traditional systems, the necessity to use fossil fuels in the harvest and the hauling, and then in the feeding of the forage to the cows is really, really significant, and it's part of the cost savings. In terms of greenhouse gas emission, our saving is not so large if we look at the total herd and we include methane emission and nitrous oxide, but if you look at the savings in fossil fuels, it's substantial. And in terms of on-farm energy use, we're reducing the on-farm energy requirement for winter feeding by 50%. So that's a significant improvement, and we're quite proud of that. Now let's just quickly go to some cow factors, because we talked about, usually when we talk about the system, we need to talk about cow factors, forage factors. We didn't say environmental factors, but that's very true, and we'll be talking about that. And then we talked about the economic impact. But for a minute or two, let's talk about some of the cow factors that are important. When we first started talking about how we were going to reduce the winter feeding cost of beef cows, we understood that it was going to be the cow system, and that's totally surrounded by the reproductive cycle of the beef cow. So we are concerned, our summer pasture is shown here up to September. But the part that we're concerned about is this period from October to March, if our cows are going to calve in the March-April period. And we see that as lactation goes down and cows are weaned, then their nutrient requirement is not so large. In fact, it's much smaller than it was earlier and later. And so we have some options here in saving feed, and we have to take advantage of them. If we look here in October, November, December, the amount of feed is low, and so we can take the opportunity to reduce the amount of feed or feed lower quality forages during that time. And in swath grazing or in any type of extended grazing, you would want to be limit grazing this time, otherwise you're wasting feed. And it's one way to increase the carrying capacity, and the importance of which we'll talk about later. As we move through the gestation period closer to calving into the third trimester, we start to need much more intake of digestible dry matter and an increase in protein. But we also have some other options, and those options are getting cows in good condition or fat in October, November, and December by feeding higher quality forages that may deteriorate later. So we have to think about all these facts and the cow factors so that we end up with a healthy bunch of calves in the spring. So John, I'll let you take over now.
Well, thanks for the great introduction there, Vern. Um, just to give an idea of what animals work best for fall and winter grazing, referring back to that slide that Vern just showed about the energy needs for a mature cow. Basically, that cow who's dry, not lactating through the winter, so someone who's calving in late April through till late June, they're really our ideal cow. Um, can't emphasize enough, though, that you want that cow to be in good condition going into the winter, to have that good layer of back fat. That's the insulation that she needs to help keep warm. Late lactation cows, again, their energy needs are going up, but if they're in good condition and you're able to provide the reasonable quality feed, they can do quite well with winter grazing. Bred heifers need a little more on the protein end. You'd have to baby them a little bit more. The same with backgrounding yearlings. That gets a little dicier. Early lactation cows, you do have to be very mindful of the energy intake on early lactation cows as you're getting them ready to rebreed, and we don't want to sacrifice reproductive efficiency for the sake of trying to lower our feed costs through the winter. And wean calves, definitely wouldn't want to go there without a whole lot of high quality feed going into that.
So John, do you want to pause
Yes.
for a minute and do the poll questions here?
Sure.
All right. So we now have an opportunity for you guys to all participate who are watching here. So we have a couple poll questions here. So just as they come up on your screen, you can click your answer. So you can see they're up on the screen. You can click yours. Your answers here are anonymous to everybody who's watching. So the question that we're asking is, what forms of extended grazing are you presently using? And I'm sorry, actually, it looks like you can only click one of the options. So the options are none, bale grazing, swath grazing, corn grazing, or stockpiled forages. So click the one that most applies for you. And I'll give you guys a couple more seconds to get your answers in. All right, so it looks about 37% of people on the webinar aren't using any forms of extended grazing. 20% are using bale grazing, 18% using swath grazing, about 6% grazing corn, and 18% are grazing stockpile forages. So that gives you a little idea of who's attending. Our next questions here. So this one you can click all that apply for you. So which factors would influence you to choose extended grazing? So is it the labor, the economics, manure management, or cow performance? So you can once again select all that apply for on your operation. And once again, I'll give you about 5 more seconds here to get your final answers in. All right, so for this one, it looks like about 65% of people say labor savings is one of the factors. 78% say economics, 54% say manure management, and 43% say cow performance. And our last poll question for now. So which of these factors may inhibit you from choosing extended grazing on your operation? So once again, it's labor, economics, cow performance, weather, or other. And I'm sorry, again, it looks like this one we can only choose one answer, so pick the one that most applies on your operation. So I'll give you another 5 seconds here. All right, so results for this one. 2% say that labor, 8% say economics, 16% cow performance, 66% say weather, and 8% say other. So weather is a big factor that's influencing them. All right, so that's what we have for poll questions. So take it away, John. Slide's very
Well, that
important with our last question.
I know that final question is just a perfect lead into this. The environment definitely and the weather definitely has a big impact on how our animals are going to be performing out there with fall winter grazing. And temperature is very important, that change in air temperature. Once we get away from barns or yards that have some sort of windbreak and a bit more control on ambient temperature that the animals feel, this becomes a big concern for us. Each of our animals, like species in our, will have what's called a lower critical temperature based on its physiology. For beef cows, that's somewhere around minus 10 degrees Celsius. So once the air temperature drops below minus 10, the basic maintenance energy it takes just to keep that cow alive starts to go up and up and up. If it's raining and to some degree snow, that can affect this lower critical temperature as well, especially rain, because that'll tend to make the hair wet and then reduce the insulation value of it. We know wind chill affects the temperature that we feel. We get the wind chill effect. It can make it feel much colder outside than it is. And in combination with wet weather, this can really raise the energy needs. The amount of mud, and this is especially a consideration in eastern Canada, that the animals having to deal with, that just increases the amount of energy that they use just to walk around. I know just from doing ration formulations for feedlots and that, the mud depth is one of those factors you put in there, and it can really have a big impact just on what it takes for the animals to move from A to B. And again, with that getting around, a lot of times when we're setting up winter grazing situations, there's some distance from the water to the shelter to where the feed may be. So that's also a factor. What can we do to cope with the environment, though? There's a whole lot of ways that we can deal with this. We've mentioned before, and you can't mention it enough, make sure the animals are in good body condition when we go into the fall. Fat and hair, they're great insulators. I mean, we know that, and it's just, we want them to be in good shape. On the hair front, too, we do want to make sure we have lice control. That's something that I've actually seen be an issue at times in the winter when you'll have a good chunk of the animal's hair come off. So little things like that can make a fair difference. We can plan to do our extended grazing in areas that may have some shelter. That could be natural trees or planted windbreaks. It could be that we're providing artificial shelter like man-made windbreaks or portable windbreaks, which are not uncommon in Western Canada, I understand, and we have a few of those around Nepean now. And even for starting out, and I've done this myself, you can start your bale grazing experience or your winter grazing experience close to the barn, so you have you kind of have that little safety factor in there, so that just to build your comfort level as you go along. This is just a picture of our portable windbreaks we have at Nepean. So I think there's about 40 or 50 of our cows are making use of this on a bit of a stormy day in January. These windbreaks, actually, it doesn't take a lot of a windbreak to give a really good area for the cattle to get shelter, and it's about 15 to 20 times the height of that windbreak is where they get shelter downwind from that. If you look at these cows, you can see that the snow is sitting on their hair rather than melting, and that just shows that their back fat and their hair is doing a good job of insulating them. If that snow were melting, then we'd be concerned that our cows were losing a lot of heat through their body surface, and we don't want that. And you can also see these cows have, they're fairly flat across the top. They're in pretty good shape. We have data from 4 years of bale grazing from January, February at Nepean, and it shows that we have minimal losses in body weight. Typically our body weight doesn't change over the course of the winter, and our body condition might change by about half to 1 point on a 9-point scale over the winter. In Atlantic Canada, we have a few challenges that are different from those that we see in Western Canada, I think. A lot of it has to do with the fall period in particular. We have a lot of variation in our weather. Right now we're having quite a rainstorm today. Snow flurries in there. Frozen ground is not something we can rely on typically until January, and even that's not a given for us. And our winter has a lot of freeze-thaw potential through January, February into March. So that can turn our snow cover into ice, which can be a real challenge for the animals to get through snow. We've done a little bit of work with grazing corn, so I'm going to go through some of our work we've done at Nepean over the last 6 6 or 8, 10 years. I guess going back to time flies. One of the challenges we saw with some of our corn grazing in Nepean, our crude protein level was down to 6%, so that's getting a little low. When we were doing this project, our cows were in their third trimester. We had January, February calving cows, and so we were grazing this in November, December. So our protein level was a bit low. Because of our weather conditions we get with a lot of rain through the fall, a lot of the protein was leached from the leaves. And mud was a bit of a concern too, where we didn't have frost consistently in the ground. If we move on to the next slide, we can see kind of what the conditions looked like for these girls when they were grazing through November, December. And you can see there's a fair bit of mud there. It was a challenge from a research standpoint. It was a challenge to kind of determine how much of the feed they're eating, but also it's hard to get them to use a sufficient percentage of the feed that's in the field if it gets trampled down into the mud. Whereas with frozen ground, you can still ask them to clean it up, and they may eventually get there. Looking at some of our animal results, and we had various iterations of this over 4 years, where we had cattle in the barn and on different fall grazing scenarios, with corn and fescue being 2 of those. You can see that these were January, February calving cows. During this October to Christmas feeding period, the barn-fed cows, they gained quite a bit of weight, lost a little bit of body condition. Similar thing with our fescue cows, but the corn cows, they lost weight and they lost body condition. And a lot of that had to do with trying to deal with the mud. The other issue that we got into, that we found, and this was quite interesting to us, was when we turned these cattle out to pasture in mid-May. You can see the red highlight there around the calf weight turnout. Those calves from the corn-fed cows were significantly lighter than either the barn or the fescue-fed cattle. So that has some bearing on how those animals will look come weaning time in the fall as well. I'm just going to touch on a couple of the challenges that we've really found in the Maritimes, and how we've tried to deal with them through Nepean and through a few other on-farm experiences I've been privy to in the region. Mud is a big challenge for us, and like I say, right now, if you walk on out in my lawn right out in front of my house right now, it's just all kind of jiggly. But if you have a lot of pasture biomass available, so you have a really tall grass growing into the fall, that acts a bit like a snowshoe, so the animals' hooves aren't going to damage the pasture as quickly. And also, when you have a taller grass, you have more root mass, so that again helps to hold the sod together. Frequency of moving is really important. The more often you move the cattle to new pasture, the less damage there will be. You can get a better job spreading your manure around too, so that's a good thing. It's really hard to avoid mud though when you're grazing when the frost is coming out of the ground. We can have the top 6 or 8 inches of the ground can be thawed out and full of water, and a layer of ice below that. So that's one of those times when you want to maybe ensure that your animals are on an area that you don't mind having a bit of sacrifice. Maybe you're going to use that for some sort of a cropping system in that next year, so you're taking advantage of those extra nutrients going down. And we do find that fields that have been rotationally grazed through the previous season tend to have a stronger sod, more so than those that have just strictly been hayed. This is one of my favorite slides when it comes to anything to do with grazing management. Just shows how the impact of the above ground biomass on the amount of root that you will have below ground. And so if you look at the grasses on the far right, where we have a lot of biomass and above ground, and a lot of leaf for the animals to graze, gives you that higher yield that we like to see for making it more worthwhile to bother with stockpiling feed. Well, we also have a lot of root biomass there as well to try and carry the cows. That handles the wet conditions a lot better. This is just a picture of some bale grazing done in late November. This was a sward that had been grazed all through the summer. And after heavy rain, you can see we don't really have any pugging, no real damage to the sward. Just we have some residual there and some manure put down, which this was done on a particularly poor piece of land, so it was part of the goal was to try and increase fertility there, and we achieved that without damaging too much. Here we have a slide that shows a 2-acre paddock that was grazed by 40 head of beef cows, and this is for 5 days. And the picture is taken from the gateway, so you can see there was little mud damage when the animals came running out of the pasture, and that's running animals tend to be a little harder on the ground than nice quietly grazing ones. But this was just following 35 millimeters of rain in the last 3 days, and very wet section of ground, but still minimal damage. And these this just management to avoid mud. You can do it and be fairly successful with it. And just going into grazing into Christmas again, we still don't have frost in the ground here. Cows don't mind grazing through the snow. That's not a problem. They actually they seem to kind of like it. They're pretty good at finding the good quality grasses, and yeah. We have a little bit of experience from Nepan doing some swath grazing. We had occasion one year to try this. We had a group of cows that was calving in June. So we set up to try grazing some swathed millet and fall rye, which we planted in late June. I'm guessing, it was our first time growing this particular crop. We didn't get the yield we had hoped to get. We only had about 4,000 kilograms per hectare. So these were with some summer calving cows. So we grazed this through the month of January. We only had a small group of cows and a small group of land to work with, but we just wanted to kind of give it a try and see what our challenges might be. As luck would have it, the year that we did this was actually one of our probably most challenging years we could have had to try swath grazing. We didn't get frost in the ground, so a lot of our residuals trampled, so we couldn't figure out exactly how much they ate. We also had a hard time forcing them to eat as much as we would like them to. The other thing is, just before we started swath grazing this, we had about 2 feet of snow that came down. It was a heavy, wet snow, and then it turned cold after that, so the snow turned very much to ice. However, true to the experience that we had gotten from reading up on what goes on out in Lacombe and other parts in the Western Canada, the cows would find those swaths. They would clean that, they'd follow that from one end of the field to the other. Would strip that out over every couple of days. We were giving them a new piece of the field, and you can see they found the swaths. They dug through the snow, and it was overall a successful experience. The cows, they maintained body weight and body condition for the time that we did that. Just a little note on the residual that's left behind. I mean, a lot of the percentage utilization you get on your bale or swath grazing has to do with how hard you force them to graze. Anywhere from 75 to 95% is possible with bale grazing, depending on a number of conditions. But what's left behind for that residual, along with the urine and manure that goes down, it's fairly quickly incorporated into the growing pasture again as the growing season begins. And as we'll see in the next slide here, even in mid-April, we're seeing a lot of grass coming up through, and by late June, early July, you can hardly find any except for the bigger clumps of grass. So, the fertility benefits from bale grazing are definitely huge for the area where you put it. The other challenge, and I know this is something that a lot of people deal with, and we'd had to deal with this a couple of winters ago here in Nova Scotia, is extreme snow. I've experienced with bale grazing from I guess 16 or 17 years now. But 2 years ago, when we hit 4 feet of snow in the field, it was quite an experience. So you can see here we have a group of cows who were making their way to one of their new rows of bales. This would be in late March, and this was just a year when we just had a heck of a lot of snow to deal with. Instead of using fences, actually what we were doing is just going along and opening up the tops of the bales so the cows could see where the fresh hay was. Surprisingly, there's only about an inch and a half of damage to the top of the bales where we had loss in quality. But if you look on the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see where the cows had cleaned up their last strip of bales, and they have a nice job. They kind of just made themselves a little trail. It's probably 2 feet of ice underneath that path that they have, but snow is a challenge, yes, and this is one of the reasons why I'm a bit of a fan of bale grazing for reducing the risk when we get into some of these more extreme weather conditions. If we've been using stockpiled grazing, there's no way we could have ever hoped to have the animals graze through 4 feet of snow. With bale grazing, yes, they can find their way to the bales, and once they get there, they have their path. And you can see with this picture here that they do a good job of cleaning that up right down to where the ground is. So they do fairly well with that. If you just take note here, you'll see on a typical snowstorm, when you have a lot of wind blowing, there's not too much snow built up around the bales anyway. It tends to, the wind swirls and keeps the snow away from the bales. And as we'll see, the cows, they have no trouble finding the bales in under these sort of more normal conditions. I think our next slide shows that. You'll see a group of cows here. You can see them, there's lots of room for them to get in and get access to the bales, and they can do a pretty good job of cleaning up all the feed that we would want them to clean up. And just a final note on snow. This just shows a snow melt in the spring of the year, and you can see when you have tree lines or hedgerows or anything, the snow tends to be the deepest closest to your trees. So if you try to plan to have your feed that you're feeding set up far enough away from the trees that it's not going to be in the really deep snow, it helps you to avoid this challenge as well. The animals will still be able to make their way back to the shelter and get along quite fine, but then the feed is going to be much more available to them. So just as a final note from our experiences here at Nepan, is all this worthwhile? We have an economics master's student who's just finishing up his work right now, and he did a comparison on the economics of grazing in the winter in the Maritimes, looking at 200 days of barn feeding to 75 days of stockpiled feed and 125 days of bale grazing, which is a system that we have a few people that are using successfully here in the Maritimes. Looking at an 80 cow calf herd with spring calving, the savings he calculated were about $183 per cow with winter grazing. So to me, that's a fairly significant dollar to have in your pocket at the end of a day. There's a learning curve that goes with it, yes, but I think that shows that there's value in going through that learning process. I think I'm going to turn things back over to Vern now.
Thanks, John. If we look forward in this whole business of extended grazing, and we think back to where we started out from, our goal was to reduce the costs of harvest, hauling, processing, and manure removal. Well, we've shown that that's feasible, and we've shown that we can bring cow herds through the winter, at least a significant portion of the winter, at least up until the latter part of before they calve, with extended grazing. If we want to improve where we're at from now on, if we want to go beyond that, we're going to have to start eating away at the crop cost or the feed cost, and doing a better job of learning how to graze during winter. And so I use this pasture math to kind of help guide my program, and you might be able to use it to help you make some decisions on your farm. Our goal is to reduce our daily cost, and we can multiply that up to 100 cows per 100 days, and we compare that to whatever traditional method you might have or the method you're using now. And that's going to be different wherever you are, and every farm is different. And so when you say, oh, I can't save as much as they do at Lacombe, or I can't save as much as they do at Nepan, you could be right. But you will save something, and the first thing you're going to save is to reduce your yardage. But once you go beyond that, then we have to look at some of the things about grazing and crop production, whether it's a perennial crop or an annual crop for extended grazing. So the first thing to look at is yield. The higher the yield, the higher the carrying capacity we can get. Then we know that there are some waste, because John talked about utilization being about 90%. Well, if your utilization is 50%, then you've only got half of the yield that you grew that can go into grazing. So your carrying capacity is going to be reduced. So you think about that, and then we also think about the maintenance requirement, or the minimum amount of feed in dry matter that's required to get a cow through a day without losing weight. And as we showed, that changes depending on the stage of gestation. But if we can increase the quality of the feed, it takes less pounds or kilograms per day to maintain the cow, then that tends to increase the carrying capacity. We take the carrying capacity and we divide it by the pasture cost and the operation cost, the cost to grow and the cost to operate the pasture, and we end up with an average daily cost. And so we see we have to increase yield, we have to manage to maximize utilization, and we have to keep our quality as high as we possibly can throughout the winter. So in looking forward, our goals are to increase the yield for mid-September swathing or harvest or grazing, whatever our system is. The higher the yield, the better off we're going to be. We want to reduce the dry matter requirement for maintenance on average throughout the winter by improving quality or nutritive value. And we might do this by choosing crops that weather well or don't have a great deal of loss in quality over winter. Some species are going to have higher quality, some species lower quality. There are trade-offs between yield and quality. So we're going to have a number of different things we need to look at and decisions we have to make. One thing that we're starting to look at is being aware of the impact of utilization. And we've always done this. We've always tried to measure the amount of residue that's left after grazing in the spring or during the winter and compare that to what we started out with. And we look at the implications of that. And we really became acutely aware of that in 2013, 2014. I'm not sure, but John kind of beat us with his 4 feet of snow, but 3 feet of snow in Lacombe is a whole lot. And really does reduce the utilization. So why should we care about yields? In the beef industry, we want to keep costs low, and when we think about yields, we just think about cost, don't we? But there is a relationship between yield and carrying capacity. And if we look at our average yields of a number of experiments that we had that included corn, triticale, barley, oats, and stockpiled grass, and most of these experiments were conducted over 5-year periods, so we have a lot of data. So we see that on one end we have triticale being high yield and stockpiled grass being a low yield. And we've come to understand that barley or oats planted in the middle of June and swath in the middle of September will yield somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 kilograms per hectare, 6 to 8 tons, 6,000 to 8,000 pounds per acre. And that's kind of about the equivalent of 200 cow days per acre. We've come to believe that that's about average. Now, we look at our stockpiled grass, and while it's very inexpensive, it's about 77 cow days per acre. So these sorts of things have to be weighed against one another to determine how long we can expect to graze them. Then we look at the relationship between carrying capacity and the daily cost we talked about, and keep in mind that while all of these cost more or less, that still in the traditional system we're looking at $2 to $3 a day to keep a cow in a feedlot or in a feeding site, then we see all of them save us money. So it's all good, except that some of them in certain cases and certain places are going to be better than others. So we see that while stockpiled grass didn't really cost so much per acre, $29, it also didn't have a high carrying capacity and brings its cost, daily cost up fairly close to swath grazing, barley, and oats. Corn costs a lot more to grow than barley and oats, but on average, particularly in places like southern Manitoba where corn yields can be quite high, up to 17 tons per hectare, then we can get a very high carrying capacity, and we surpass corn with triticale at Lacombe, but that's at Lacombe. Going on to looking at quality and weathering and what those impacts might be, and we're using swath grazing to illustrate this, but I have to believe that you would get similar things with other methods. It just takes more energy to winter graze, no matter what method you're going to use. If you're grazing stockpiled grass, if you're going to graze bale graze, or whatever you are, it just takes more energy per day to maintain the weight of the cow than it does for her to stand in front of a feed bunk. And we usually think that it's going to take about 20% more energy per day per cow to get through the winter. So from that standpoint, it's not more efficient. But we believe the cost savings outweigh that. So what I did for this talk is I took the initial quality, like quality in the fall, not the quality later in the year, but the quality in the fall, averaged over all these studies that we've done in the years. So we have swath grazed barley with an IVTD, or in vitro true digestibility, 57%. And then at the other end of the scale, we had stockpiled grass that was 68%. And we found that there was a relationship between, the lower the quality, the more weight the cow would lose from the beginning to the end of grazing. And they all grazed in the area of about 100 days. And I think, the lowest was 80 and the highest was 120 days. So they were all at similar stages of gestation. So the higher quality ones like corn and grass tended to maintain weight better than the others. Now we can't afford to lose some weight. We don't want to go below body condition score of 2.5, and we didn't have problems with calving, but you just have to be aware that quality is meaningful. So if we look a little more closely at stockpile grass versus swathed oats, which is what we were looking at the time, here's the difference in digestibility. And using in vitro digestibility, we have our stockpile grass, all leafy green material, leaf blades mostly, and we have somewhere around 68%, and then 57% I think we had with oats. When we look at protein, we were a little surprised at the time. We shouldn't have been, but we were. We would have expected this grass to have protein content well over 10%, up around 12, even 14%. But when we looked at some of the agronomic data that we published in agronomy journals some years ago, we found that we can expect that the protein content of the grass is probably relatively low and often below 12%, if not around 8 to 10%. And the oat in this case was higher. An interesting thing that we talked about, and John and I discussed this earlier today when we did our dry run, and this is looking at the forage quality over a 4-day period when we make a 4-day allocation of swath to cows. Some producers move cows every day, and in this case, we were moving cows every 3 days and every 4 days, and giving them fresh swath. And we allocated them an equal amount of swath and enough swath that would let them get through those 4 days on average. For example, we probably gave them about 12 kilograms per cow per day, whether it was corn or whether it was triticale. And interestingly enough, we see if we look at IVTD, which is digestibility, of course, corn was higher in this case than triticale, but immediately when cows go out to graze corn or any of these cereals, they graze the grain first, and you can see they grazed the corn cobs first, and then what was left was the corn stover, and the quality was lower from the time we went from day 1 to day 4. Fiber increased, crude protein decreased, and while corn was decidedly better in terms of nutritive value to begin with, it quickly dropped below triticale. Now, if we calculate the total nutrients that were fed over the 4-day period, it probably reflects what the cattle, the nutrient value of the cow at first. But you wouldn't want to leave cows too long on residue just to make them clean up, particularly when they're late in gestation. And you can see the dry matter consumption here on the lower right-hand side, where cows did graze more corn early and more early on in the 4-day period than later on. We're going to talk about weathering now, and weathering refers to the loss in quality from the time we swath until the time it's fed out in the swath at any point in the winter. And weathering loss in quality can occur due to in swaths due to loss of grain dropping on the ground. It can occur from freeze thaw. from the cells in the plant becoming fragile and not very flexible, and so they become brittle, and they are very susceptible to washout when you get, in other words, sugars wash out of the cells as the snow melts and when you get rain. So we just find that we can move along. Once we get some initial loss during the fall, we can move throughout the winter with very little loss in quality. But as soon as we get freezing and thawing going on, and a lot of slushy snow, then our quality will start to go down. So this is a study that we carried out for 3 years. It was funded by BCRC, and we're looking here at simply the average of barley, corn, oat, triticale, and winter cereals planted in the spring. And the winter cereals planted in the spring would be like stockpile forage. And all we're looking at here is TDN, just one of the things. In reality, we did see differences among the species from year to year and time to time. It's just that it's hard to show. And when we average over years, this is what we get. And we found that a little bit contrary to what John found, that the corn maintained its quality the best. You can see that it increased throughout the winter, but then when you look at the other species, it tended to maintain its quality. The winter cereals were in the middle, and the spring cereals would have changed places from year to year, but by and large all decreased. Now, is this bad? Well, it's not good, but the fact is that the amount of quality loss didn't really make that much difference when we look at how cows performed under swath grazing. But all our cows are starting off under good body condition in the fall. When we look at this study and we plot it against the net energy requirement of the cow on a daily basis throughout her gestation period from October to March, like we did right at the beginning, we can see that close to calving during March, none of these species completely fulfilled their nutrient requirement of the cow. So you kind of have to look forward and backward in your system, and some supplementation may be possible. But if you have done your job early on in the year and positioned whatever species you need sequentially throughout the year, it may be that you will work out quite well and your body condition score will remain high, and your empty body weight of the cow, if it's calculated, is probably going to work out on at least on the break-even side. Just to kind of reinforce what happens during the winter, some years ago we did work on stockpiled forage, and we measured forage quality at all months during the year, and we had a whole series of grasses that we looked at, and then we looked at alfalfa and alfalfa mixtures. And you can see that with meadow brome grass and 2 of the grass species that we used, and John talks about tall fescue being good and the fescues being good for grazing, we found that meadow brome grass and creeping red fescue were 2 of the grasses that were good. And I'll ask John later on to talk about his experience with legumes. We've found that alfalfa maintains quality pretty good in September and October, but loses leaves rapidly after frost. Producers and other people who have worked with Sicer milkvetch have told us that they find that Sicer milkvetch maintains leaves longer, and we've seen it on farmers' fields that do so. Sicer milkvetch, on the other hand, is hard to establish, sometimes taking 3 years to establish, and also gets beat down pretty badly under snow. So John, I'm going to let you take over this slide, because this is some of the work that you did with stockpiled grass in the pan.
Yeah, this is some work that Joseph Papadopoulos and I collected over a couple of winter seasons, where we had different grass species that we collected samples of over the course of the winter. The slide we're showing here is the percent TDN through October, November, December into January. So you can see the solid lines show what our grasses had for their TDN levels. And you see they kind of tail off a little bit after the frost. The growing season ends in late October. But it was interesting to note that the orange line that really drops off fast, that's reed canary grass. And It's a grass that can grow quite well in the fall. You can get a lot of volume, but it loses its quality very quickly, and it yellows almost instantly after your first frost. Within a couple of days, you see the change in the coloring. Um, the dotted lines you see going across here show the energy needs of various animals that we might be choosing to graze on these stockpiled grasses through the fall. And you can see that for our bluegrass, meadow fescue, or timothy, they hold their quality quite well into January for all but some of our really high energy needing animals like a growing lamb or growing finishing steer. So as far as for our dry cows or for our maintenance type animals, up into January, these stockpiled bluegrass, meadow fescue, timothy are holding more than enough TDN. And I don't have the slide for this in this presentation, but our protein content was between 12 and 14 on all of these grasses. Well, actually, well into March. So they did hold their protein fairly well.
Just to close our conversation here on extending the grazing season with swath grazing and bale grazing, we'll talk a little bit about utilization. And utilization in the field is very hard to measure because fields are variable, or paddocks are variable from one end to the other, and we tend to water at one end usually and move cows along up and down. So generally, while utilization rates can be quite high, we tend to utilize the paddock kind of unevenly. We just are kind of forced to do that for various reasons, like the location of water, for example. If we look at utilization, and first of all, this slide is a bit complicated, but there's a number of things that we want to talk about. We want to talk about, in swath grazing anyway, about the effect of yield and also about the effect of snow and what we expect for utilization rates. We've had utilization rates in triticale, barley, oats, and corn anywhere from 68, 65% to about 90%. And I would expect that we would average somewhere around 80% for utilization. And from what John tells me in bale grazing, and it all depends on management, he can expect to get about 90% utilization with bale grazing. And the work that Darren Burchell is doing with the Grey-Wooded Forage Association near Caroline also is showing that he gets in that range. So we can expect in normal conditions or good conditions for each of these systems, we should be expecting to get 80 to 90% utilization. So what happens if we don't? Well, our costs probably, under normal conditions, are going to be lower with higher yielding crops and lower yielding crops. And that would be, for example, in the blue line for triticale and barley at Lacombe in this particular year, if we're using these examples. And then we have a lower yield from barley that was grown in Saskatoon that Pat Juskew and I were working with for barley, and the cost is higher. So as we move from higher to lower utilization, we don't have a large increase in cost, but when we get into these situations with deep snow, and some people call them a wreck, they are deep snow situations, we have to learn how to handle them, where our utilization goes from 40 to 50%. Under those conditions, we're really starting to get our costs moving up, because we're just not feeding as much of that feed. Our carrying capacity is going down. Yes, we retrieve some of that in terms of soil nutrients, but basically the bottom line is what you get from each year, and the cost goes up. High yields are also important in terms of building a large swath. Large swaths that can be maybe 3 to 4 feet wide and 18 inches high at times, are easy to access under any amount of snow. And it also is kind of like a road sign for cows, showing them where to go and graze. So bottom line is that high yield and big swaths are one way to get around utilization problems. But the story is not that simple. When we first started out, we realized that swath grazing or extended grazing is a pretty crude system, quite frankly. It's not as much finesse that goes into that as feeding a dairy cow in a milking parlor or a beef steer in a feedlot. So for us to think that we could get differences in utilization with different varieties and species was a little bit much for me to handle. But we thought that we would take a look at it because producers kept coming to us and saying, well, my cows won't eat triticale, or my cows won't eat oats. And often it had to do with the way that they were managing their fences. But when we did start to look at the differences between different varieties for utilization and various other things, we see that there may well be differences in utilization, and it may be influenced by time of harvest and just the innate things or traits about the species and varieties that we're using. And this is something that we'll be looking at for a few years here at Lacombe, and it may well impact the pocketbook as well. So now we've come to the end of our talk, and I guess John and I kind of have an opportunity to make a few concluding comments before we take some questions. So John, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, Vern's mentioned quite a few times about, the risks that are associated with winter grazing. We're learning a lot. We still have a lot to learn. What we have offered up here tonight are some experiences that we have that we feel help control the risk, and some ways of trying to keep our costs down. Even looking when Vern was showing his previous slide here, where he was grazing through deep snow and bale grazing, his costs were still somewhere in that $1 to $1.20 per cow per day, which referring back to that $2 to $3 per cow per day for barn feeding. Even under our less than optimal conditions, it's still got a cost saving. And at the end of the day, this is a prime year to look at where prices took a big tumble on the feeder end of things, and all those dollars that we can save, it all helps.
So in my turn for concluding comments, I would say that John is quite right. The size of the prize is very high. The number of dollars that producers can save by extended grazing as opposed to feeding in a feeding site or a barn or whatever is prevalent in your region are very significant. And nothing is done without risk. But you have to recognize that there are risks. And when we first started grazing, all we wanted to do was to reduce the yardage cost. Our risk, we thought, was in getting cows through and having calves well. So we can see that there's a really good probability of being successful in extended grazing and reducing your costs. What we've been able to do is to deconstruct the system of winter feeding by doing this, and dividing up into the components parts allows us to put some real science behind looking at this whole business of winter feeding. And it's a complicated science because, yes, indeed, it moves all the way from your soil health things that everybody's interested in these days, and nutrient cycling and reducing the amount of fertilizer that you apply, all of the agronomic things that you would learn and use in normal crop production, we have to start applying to swath grazing. But we have to find out how to optimize all of that. And so that's what we hope to do in the future. And I think that we really owe a debt of gratitude to BCRC and the beef cluster to maintain and stick with us with this research that they're allowing us to do. It really allows us to put some science into this system of winter feeding.
I agree.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. That was fantastic. So we've already got actually a lot of questions coming in. So yeah, we'll start with questions. So once again, you can type your questions into the chat window on your control panel. If your control panel is closed, you should see a little orange arrow on your screen, and that will allow you to open the control panel again. Also for this one, if it is relevant to your question, please include your location as well. So, as I said, we've got lots coming in, I think 4 or 5 already. So we'll get going on this. And so if you do have questions, make sure you get them in early because we may have to cut it off a little bit here. So the first question we had, which was sent in right at the beginning, is they're wondering whether when you're bale grazing versus rationing your feed daily or rolling out your hay, what is the expected % increase in feed consumption? So, for example, if they're feeding solely hay, what is the estimate comparison between the two practices?
You want to take that one, Vern?
Well, John and I actually discussed this question. So either we're a pair of bright guys or we're thinking the same way you are. I think that the literature would indicate that we could expect, and depending on how you would feed hay, like large round bales and a hay feeder, you might expect to get up to 20% loss. Now, John, am I right in that? I think it could be about that much.
Anyway, it depends on the type of feeder, but yeah, 15 to 25 is well documented.
So when John talks and people like Darren Burchell talk about losing, 10% or 15%, and under bad weather conditions, 20%, we know it's really hard to make those measurements. So we hope they're right. But it looks like there's not that much difference, is it, John?
No, I think it really depends on the conditions and how you manage things.
All right. Now, I have another question that came in here, and it's got a lot of components to it. So I think just for the sake of time, I'm going to pick one, and feel free to type in another one at another point, and if I get to it, we will. So this one is for you, Vern. So what do you think about adding crop cocktail seeds, and would there be any value to that when extended grazing?
The question is, what about when you say crop cocktail, you could mean any species you want. So I guess I would have to know the species, and that's a problem. I don't think there's been enough research to know about that. It depends on what species you're talking about. You have to take into account the amount, the cost it's going to cost you for the extra seed that you would have above what you're getting. Normally, in any mixture, you get an average yield of the yield components. And so I'd say take the average of what you think you would get across all those that multi-species mix, and that's probably what you're going to get for yield. Other than that, I really can't say.
All right. The next question here is for John. So when some of the data you were talking about, are you leaving bales where they drop, or do you move them around to set up for bale grazing?
With what we've been doing, we've been moving the bales to set up for bale grazing, just because it's we've been trying to concentrate the bales. In the Nepan situation, what we've been doing is using our bale graze fields as our corn silage fields in subsequent years. So we're trying to concentrate a fair bit of fertility in those areas, so we wouldn't have that much coming off the field in that one harvest. So we're increasing the nutrient density quite a bit that way.
All right. So this goes to either of you. Have you ever done feed tests on bales that you are using for bale grazing, and then again in the spring, and have the nutrients been lost over the winter?
Yes, and there's minimal loss through the winter with the bale grazing. Although I will say a lot depends on the quality of the bale. I've seen some bales that are not as tightly wound. If you have the outer layers of those bales are well wrapped or well wound, then you don't have much penetration. You only have about an inch or two that you will actually see any weathering effects, and then it's a little further than that you actually get some quality loss. But overall, your losses of energy in particular, which is usually our main nutrient of concern, is probably no more than 10% overall, and in most cases less than that.
All right. So this question probably more for you, Vern. It's from a person in Alberta. They're planning on bale grazing bred heifers for the first time this year and wondering if you happen to have any tips, additional tips to making sure that they stay in good shape throughout the winter.
That is a very good question. Now, bale grazing or grazing bred heifers in any of these extended grazing practices is something that really we haven't done a whole lot of research on. And I will let John answer this because I'll let him give his take on it because he's the animal nutritionist. But basically, John did show in his slides that those heifers are going to require a higher nutrient level and possibly supplementation. But it will depend on the nutrient level, particularly of digestibility or ADF level at the beginning, and then allowing enough nutrients or enough feed for growth of the heifer as well as the fetus. So John, do you want to talk about that in terms of quantification?
Well, yeah, like they are a high demand animal really when you look at a bred heifer because as you mentioned they're not only growing their own body but they're trying to grow a fetus and you would want to make sure that you have a very good quality bale you're grazing and make sure that you have good protection from wind and and do everything you can to minimize the environmental impacts that are going to increase your energy needs that much more.
But
And they have high energy and high protein needs for them as well because of the growth that's going on, more so than what a dry beef cow would, a mature cow would have.
it's a really good question.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons it's a good question, and we're not pointing out our own failures here, but we try to graze in our studies cows that are over 4 years old and probably had 2 calves. And the reason is because they've kind of bottomed out in terms of their growth, and they're more similar in terms of what their requirements would be. So we don't really have really good numbers, if you like, for lack of a better word, on heifers, and we know that producers want to be able to graze those, and so I think more work needs to be done on bringing heifers through. Caution would be, we talk about risk, so there's going to be more risk in winter grazing those heifers. Bale grazing is probably one of the better ways to do it, but if you were swath grazing, you wouldn't really want to let those heifers stand out on residue and force them to graze too much. You'd want to treat them a little more nicely and leave a bit more residue for them if you could handle them as a single group. And I think that's part of the issue. Most people haven't gotten to the point of handling heifers in groups relative to the older cows in swath grazing so that they can be managed differently. But it really opens another avenue of reducing costs in our cow herds, and we do want to manage those heifers well.
All right, thanks. So the next question here is about bale grazing and the optimum amount of bales to allow access to each time you're moving the fence.
Well, that's a good question. And so much of that depends on how frequently you want to be giving them their next allotment of bales. Typically in our work at Nepean, we'll give them a 3 or 4 day allotment of bales. So you kind of do the math backwards. If you have an idea what your bales weigh, then you work back to what your estimated intake is going to be and allow a little bit extra there for a safety factor. But with twice a week, you can, that's where you can get into that comfortably 80 to 90% utilization rate. You can push that a little higher if you want to move them, give them fewer bales more frequently, but then you're increasing your labor cost. And so it's one of those balancing acts as to how much you want to.
I would add to that I'm not sure where you're from, but I'm pretty sure that some of the work that's done in Manitoba on Bale Grazing has looked at that sort of thing, and they have some of the better how-to bale grazing information on the prairies.
For sure. All right. So my next question here is about what quality of mineral would you recommend for bale or for bale grazing?
That's John's question.
Yeah, and realistically, your best bet is to have a sample of those bales taken in the fall to see, what your needs are, and presuming you're grazing a beef cow, it's fairly, talk to a nutritionist or someone with your feed company who can come up with an, a fairly good quality mineral you would want to have. Delivery of that's another challenge, but anyway, that's a different story again.
Mm-hmm.
When you get into snow and things, but yeah, you need a forage sample before you can really get into confirming what you have, because so much depends on the quality of the feed you're giving them that way.
For sure. So I have a couple questions actually that have came in from people in the Maritimes, one specifically in Prince Edward Island, but another couple from people in the Maritimes asking about mold in bale grazing and what percentage of spoilage is expected, and is there any problems with it?
Well, and again, like as I mentioned before, with the well-made bale that's got a really, is a tighter, especially the outside layer. Sometimes making hay, you want the core to be a little bit looser to allow it to air out, but the outside footer, 18 inches, should be really tightly wrapped, and there tends to be very little moisture that actually gets into further into the bale. So mold tends not to be much of an issue, and it's interesting because it's well, I'm a bit of a geek this way, but I do kind of watch the cows when you give them new bales and watch what they do, and they're pretty quick at pushing aside the parts that they don't want, and that's the part that we try not to make them clean up later on before you give them that next allotment of bales. I think there was some work done that I know I read something about in the last year or so in Western Canada, where they looked at different ways of setting your bales and the amount of moisture penetration or losses. And I recall reading that and thinking, that really is more or less the same as what we see here in the Maritimes, I'm sure. You'd probably be somewhat aware of that, are you, Vern?
No, I'm not, but
I think
there's been quite a bit. There's been quite a bit of bale placement work in all three prairie provinces, I think. And then, as I said, the Manitoba information is often most up to date. It seems to be the province that's specialized in bale grazing.
One thing you don't want to do is put the bales on the end, because then they just act like a big sponge. You want them on their side. Anyways,
Yes.
that was a learning experience.
I will be passing along some supplemental information as well to everybody who's signed up for the webinar, so I'll make sure to include some resources from Manitoba, as Vern is suggesting. So I have a couple more questions here, so if you do have something, get it in really quick, and if we have time, I can try to squeeze it in, but we'll kind of start to wrap things up here. So the next question here is from somebody in southern Alberta, and they're asking, would it make economic sense to bring bales out to our field in order for them to stay out in the field? So this is because we take most of our crop off for the dairy cows. So yeah, I'm assuming if there's a way to keep costs down, if they've already brought their bales in, does it make economic sense to bring them back out and bale graze?
Well, not being the bale grazer, I'll answer that. And that is, intuitively, the problem with bale grazing is the amount of moving around of the bales you're going to do. So if it was me and I was, for example, many producers have done this, and that is to produce bales in the field where they're going to be used. And so bales are baled and left in the field and placed and used right there, and that will be the cheapest form of bale grazing you'll find. However, on the other hand, if you talk to bale grazing gurus who really know what they're talking about, doing bale grazing on marginal land or old pastures or hilltops or that sort of thing, where the soil organic matter is probably lowest, probably gives you the biggest bang for your buck, because you're going to get the best response from the residues that you leave behind. So everybody has to make their own decisions, but bale grazing where bale grazing works and is done well, minimizing the amount of transportation and placement costs is probably a good idea.
No,
Okay.
that's right, yeah.
Okay, so next question here. So it's about comparing extended grazing versus feeding in feeders, and is there significantly more waste in extended grazing systems?
Well, I'll start that first because I don't mind making a fool out of myself. But the thing is that one would think that feeding in feed bunks would have less waste. But everybody who's done that kind of work tells you that there will be a specific feeder design and so on and so forth. And the number that we used previously about simply feeding hay versus feeding silage or something else, the 20% number is used throughout the hay feeding literature. We think that we can get our losses below that with swath grazing and with bale grazing. But the fact is that measuring those losses is an imprecise method, because we're not containing the feed in the feed bunk to begin with, so it's hard to measure. So our degree of uncertainty with measuring residues is high. And I know I'm using big words, but the fact is we strive and we think that we're not having losses any greater than you would have in a feeder, particularly with cows. But it's a little bit hard to substantiate that.
Well, I just want to go back to the fun time I have watching cows eat. And if you watch cows eat at a bale feeder, they actually behave very much the same way they do eating at a bale without a bale feeder around it. They'll take a bite of that hay, and they don't just eat it in the bale feeder, they'll pull their head out of the feeder and then eat it. And that's where a lot of these losses are coming from in bunks and in bale feeders. And because they're losing whatever's falling out of their mouth before they eat it, it's going beside the bunker, beside the feeder. So, and this is especially true with long hay as opposed to something like a chopped silage. So I think that's part of the reason why we're not really seeing a big difference in our feeding losses between bale grazing and some of our more confined situations.
Also, I'll just add, because just to complicate matters, is that the numbers that everybody gets is a percentage, and often not a quantity. And what we're finding, in pastures, you can take your pasture course in every province in the country now, and they will tell you that once animals fall on the grass or whatever they're eating, once there's manure on it or urine or have walked over it, their desire to eat that feed is not as great as when they didn't. So when we're out measuring our residue level in swath grazing or any other grazing in the field, we tend to come up with a more or less constant number. It might be around 1,000 or 1,500 kilograms per hectare. And I know you think that sounds like a lot, but every cow loses something, and every system is not 100% perfect. You will never have 100% utilization. But what we find is that that level is about the same whether they're grazing 8,000 kilogram per hectare yield or a 16,000 kilogram per hectare yield. So the percentage that you get is going to be higher with your lower yield. So it's really hard to deal with these things in terms of percent. Unless you know about feed in, feed out, it's really hard to do. So I just caution you when you hear about that. We think that we're closing in on about the same amount of loss for extended grazing methods as we are in feed bunks for cows, particularly cows fed hay.
All right, so I've just got two more questions here, so we'll finish up with those two. So the first one here is about is snow a good enough water source even for cows in later gestation, or how far can your water source be from the site that you're grazing?
Um, in Western Canada, I think, there's actually been some published research showing that snow can be a sufficient water source for cattle. And it can work quite well in Eastern Canada too. I just know from observation with our fall grazing at Nepan, when we have sufficient snow level down grazing tall fescue, you can see 10, 12 days of no tracks of the cows going anywhere near their water troughs that they have available. The place you have to be a little careful of is if you get any freeze thaw action where your snow starts to turn into ice, and then the animals can't get enough water from breaking that snow up. They can't easily eat it, and that's where it becomes a bit of a challenge. I know that's one of our problems here in the Maritimes. I'm not sure how much that issue raises its head in Western Canada.
Well, I think that the research work you're referring to is when Dr. Bruce Young was at the University of Alberta, and also Jock Buchanan Smith did some work in Guelph, and they showed that that snow could provide adequate water. And I think you have to underline snow could provide the right amount of water, but John is absolutely right. What do we say? That 10 inches of snow equals 1 inch of water, and an inch of water is thousands of gallons of water. But that has to mean that you've got fresh snow sitting in your swath field or your grazing area. If the cows have walked over all that snow and it's pure ice, there's no way cows can get enough water, and so then they do need a water source. So it is a judgment factor that you have to take into consideration. Animal care codes tell us that all animals should have adequate water. It's adequate water on that day, I guess. And yes, cows take in snow as they graze, and they graze snow.
All right, so the next question here, or the final question, is asking about what type of considerations need to be taken to minimize the potential impact for wildlife damages.
So presumably that would be wildlife damages to the crop that we're
Yes, I
swathing
assume
stock on,
so.
which was a considerable challenge for us with our corn grazing at Nepan. We had a lot of raccoon and crow issues with their going after the cobs of our corn. Now Vern's probably got a whole lot more attractive crops for wildlife with his swathed cereals. So.
Well, all we can say is that wildlife is a serious issue, particularly for some producers, and it's serious enough that it prevents them from using extended grazing practices. We know that there are there is a 3D fencing system that has been developed that is somewhat effective. I can't really describe it, but the best thing that a producer could do if he's concerned about that is to speak to their wildlife specialists and people, and many of the forage associations around Western Canada do work and can provide some information on it, although really, frankly, no system is foolproof.
All right. So I just have a couple more things to let you know about before we go tonight. So the first one is how to get more information and science-based production advice. So there's 2 different free email lists you can join here, both the Ag Canada and the BCRC website. If you have Twitter, Facebook, or a YouTube account, you can connect with us there as well. I'd also just like to point out we will have 2 upcoming webinars, one next Monday talking about what is the environmental footprint of beef production, and the second one will be on Thursday, December 8th about managing young calves to prevent diseases. So you can sign up for those, and we look forward to seeing you on those as well. So very shortly, as soon as this webinar ends, you're going to be asked to complete a short survey that asks about tonight's session and what you're most interested in for future webinar topics. So we do need your feedback to do the best job we can to deliver information that's both useful and meaningful to your operation and helps you make informed decisions. So please complete this survey for us and don't hesitate to contact me with questions, comments, or suggestions at any time. You're also, as I mentioned, going to be receiving an email from me in the next couple of days with a link to watch the recording, as well as some links to some additional methods on extended grazing methods. So that's it. I want to thank everybody at home for joining us tonight. And on behalf of everybody, thank you, Vern and John, for volunteering your time and expertise tonight. So good night.
Good night.
Good night.